Um, Let me begin with something that probably everyone in this group is very familiar with, which is the climate crisis. And I imagine some of you are aware of the IPCC news that was coming out a year or so ago now, of final warning on climate crisis. Act now or it's too late. Um, this is, coming from the Global International Consortium of Scientists sponsored by the UN, and we've seen basically zero action responding to this crisis. And you're probably familiar with some kind of graph that looks something like this, right? Where we look at greenhouse gas emissions, and we look at, if we keep going where we're headed for what scientists basically call a catastrophic temperature increase by the end of the century, in this zone of cascading amplifying feedbacks, where different elements then reinforce the movement towards basically disaster. And we see that we have drastic changes have to be done just to limit the warming to 2 degrees Celsius, which even scientists still say is a prescription for disaster. And the 1.5 we've basically blown through now. Even that really wasn't considered a safe target. So we're aware there's a real serious issue here. But here's the thing. Even if we were to somehow find some magic bullet that could actually bring this climate warming crisis down to a manageable portion, we have to recognize that the climate itself, devastating as it is just a symptom of something even greater. And this is where I want to sort of zoom out to, if you will. And maybe we can begin just by really contemplating the Earth from space, our only home. And this beautiful blue marble, still right now the only place we know of in the entire universe where life exists. And it emerged on this planet fairly early in the planet's life, about 4 billion years ago. And over those billions of years, it's only been in the last 100,000 years or so that a particular species arose that developed the cumulative power as a species to change the entire way in which the balance of life on this planet actually exists. And so we need to ask ourselves, well, how are we doing with this incredible power as a human species that we have? And as everyone in this group knows, the answer is we're doing terribly. There's really vast ecological destruction across the board that we're seeing. And just a few highlights, statistics to take note of is since 1970 alone, there's been a 69% decline in animal populations worldwide. We're looking at the beginning of what scientists are calling the 6th great extinction of species since life began on Earth. And this would be the first one actually caused by the conscious actions of one particular species. We're looking at the annihilation, the virtual annihilation of coral reefs worldwide this century. And the UN reports that 95% of Earth land will be degraded by the middle of this century. But of all statistics, the one that blows me away the most is this one, that at current rates, by 2050, there will be more plastic by weight in the ocean than fish. So a reasonable question to take from all this is, how did we get to this place where, as a species, we're causing such massive destruction of our only home? And in an earlier book I wrote some years back called The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, I looked at the different ways in which meaning making actually shaped the course of history. And what distilled from that book was this kind of simple realization, if you will, that culture in civilizations and in cultural complexes throughout history, culture shapes values, and those values are what shape history. And by the same token, today's values are what will shape the future. So let's turn at today's values to understand what they are that is shaping the future. And I think this picture is kind of iconic of our values today, that the dominant values in our global society are based on separation. Here we see everyone separate from each other, separate even from the food they're about to eat, and kind of connected more than anything to the technology that's essentially manipulating and addicting them. Um, and if we go one layer down, we can understand a little bit better the sense of this modern story of separation that we live under, which says things like, underlying it implicitly is like that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature, that humans are essentially selfish and competitive, that human progress arises from the conquest of nature, that the earth is a resource to exploit for human benefit. And then ultimately, as a result of all that, the ultimate purpose of life is really just to get wealthy and powerful. Now, this worldview, it seems like it is kind of this global way in which people act and make sense of the world, but it's actually kind of unique in all of human history. And it just developed in one place, one time, in early modern Europe, around the time the rise of the scientific revolution. Um, and what they kind of was distilled at that time really best by Francis Bacon, who's considered to be the prophet of the scientific age, when he talked about the excitement of that time to establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe. And with the rise of science, that we could render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. And Europeans really took to this new vision of empowerment, and they applied it not just to nature, to conquering nature, but also to conquering other continents. And with the power that they got and their intention towards conquering, it led this worldview to basically spread around the entire world. And we can take a moment and look at some of the implications of this worldview of separation that began in Europe around that time. Well, first off, it means seeing nature as resources and other people also as resources, which leads to these two senses, one of human supremacy over the rest of the living earth. And also because this whole idea came from these white European Christian males, there was a sense of this white supremacy over all other races in the earth, which leads to this fundamental motivational principles of extraction and exploitation, which over the centuries from that time has developed in the dominance around our world of global capitalism. And we need to recognize that global capitalism is ultimately the dominant force right now in the world. If we look at the 100 largest economies in the world, we find that 69 of those 100 are not nation states, but are transnational corporations. And global capitalism is based on this requirement of perpetual growth. Companies are valued in the stock market, not based on what they're earning that particular year, but based on the expectation of the growth in earnings that they'll show over the next 10, 20 years into the future. It's a system that is designed very well to mint billionaires. And it's one that's led to the greatest inequality in history, where right now, the wealthiest couple of dozen billionaires own as much wealth as half the entire world's population of roughly 4 billion people. And the principles underlying this global system are inherently unsustainable. So if we look at these core design principles coming from this worldview, it's things like maximize shareholder returns, keep growing at all costs, looking at material consumption as some kind of proxy of welfare, and looking at non-human nature just as a resource to exploit, which leads to this extractive directive to monetize everything as fast as possible, to turn humans into conditioned consumers, and to exploit every available resource on the earth. And if we look at basically what's been happening really since the end of the Second World War, we see how powerfully successful this system has been in doing what it intends to do. When some of you may be aware, when earth scientists look at the amount of production and consumption that's been taking place since the Second World War. They call it the Great Acceleration because virtually every place you look, there's been this kind of explosion in levels of production and consumption across the board. And when economists, mainstream economists, look at the expectation in decades to come of this production and consumption, well, they see it continuing to grow at a massive rate. They're projecting global gross domestic product to triple by around 2060. Now, some people, and you may be familiar with some of these arguments, claim that, yeah, what we need to do is try to target what's called green growth, the sense, well, where maybe we can grow, maybe we can continue to grow the economy, but actually separate it from the raw material consumption we're using or climate breakdown. But there is no empirical evidence for this kind of magic bullet of what's called absolute decoupling of GDP growth from material consumption. So, and this has been, shown quite rigorously in papers such as this one, Decoupling Debunked. All you need to do is look at this graph of GDP growth and raw material consumption, and we see that both are going at almost exactly the same pace for decades now. And as a result of this, scientists are warning that we're rapidly heading for a precipice. A number of scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Institute, led by Johan Rockström, some of you may be familiar with this analysis, have looked at 9 planetary boundaries, defining what they call the safe operating space for humanity. Well, those 9 planetary boundaries is that small circle in the green. And when they measure what we're actually doing, we've seen that in 6 of those 9, we've blown through that safe operating space. So scientists are putting out these warnings to humanity that soon it will be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory. Professor Hans Schellenhuber, if we continue down the present path, there's a very big risk we will end our civilization. And even we see UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying we're headed for collective suicide. So where are we headed as a human race? Well, when we look at the big picture of transitions that have happened in the human experience ever since humans evolved in our modern as Homo sapiens, we see just a couple of phase transitions when there was an absolute transformation in the total lived experience and values that humans had around the world. One began around 10,000 years ago when we began to transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agriculture. Another happened in that scientific revolution that I touched on a few minutes ago, beginning in Europe, just 400 years ago. And anyone who's looking closely at our current 21st century right now, basically is convinced that we are right now encountering a transformation as big, as profound as those ones that happened in history. The question is, and I believe it's still not clear, where is that transition going to take us? Well, one scenario is what those scientists were warning about, like basically some kind of collapse of our entire civilization. And that's one possible place we might go this century. There's another scenario, which sometimes is called Fortress Earth, almost like basically the sort of surveillance state where the elites barricade themselves off, exploring how to use AI and basically all kinds of genetic engineering even to improve themselves, to sort of become a transhuman race, while most of the world experiences some version of collapse. That's another scenario that, from a moral standpoint, may be even more morally egregious than that total collapse of humanity. But I believe, many people believe, there is a third scenario, something between those two extremes where we can actually maintain some kind of sustainable flourishing into the future. And that's what we're going to explore now as we go forward, which is something that is called increasingly by people the notion of an ecological civilization. And so what is an ecological civilization? it would require basically a transformation in the basis of our global civilization. So we're talking about a transformation as extreme as those other two we were looking at, but it would be a transformation that led from a wealth-based society to one that is actually life-based. It would basically be a transformation to a global cultural and economic system that promotes sustainable flourishing for humans and the earth. And the overriding objective of this civilization would be not to exploit, extract, and get rich as you can, but to create the conditions for all people to flourish as part of a thriving, living earth. And now, what is exciting about this emerging vision of an ecological civilization is it's not coming from just a small group of people trying to come up with some new great solution to the world, but it's emerging from a diverse set of sources, from indigenous sources. Some of you may know some of these phrases, Buen Vivir and Sumac Corse from South America, and Ubuntu from Africa. From permaculture principles, rights of nature movements, transition towns, there's theories of the commons, there's the degrowth movement, the agroecology movement. On the spiritual front, there's all kinds of traditions like deep ecology, engaged Buddhism, traditional Chinese principles, there's Christian liberation theology. And on the political front, there's things like anti-globalization movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, and eco-socialism. Each of these different groups, in their different ways, are moving towards a shared vision of a life-affirming future. And when we look at how to make sense of this notion of an ecological civilization, we can begin by starting to understand what are the principles by which ecologies actually work? How do living systems self-organize? Because ecosystems have proven to be remarkably resilient and healthy based on principles of life that evolved in these ecosystems over hundreds of millions or even billions of years. And these principles allow ecosystems to remain resilient for millions of years in spite of all kinds of perturbations until basically human modern civilizations come along to destroy them. But so one of the core principles to understand is people believe from this dominant worldview that nature, not just humans, but nature is selfish based on the selfish gene or whatever. But actually, nature is not selfish. If we look over billions of years, all the way from the rise of single cells on Earth billions of years ago to the major steps that led to increased complexity of life, such as the rise of complex cells, eukaryotes, or multicellular life, or simple animals or mammals, we see every one of those great phase transitions in the complexity of life on Earth arose from increases in cooperation, not from some species figuring out how to outcompete other species around them. Life actually evolved through cooperation. In the words of the systems biologist Lynn Margulis, life didn't take over the world by combat, but by networking. And just as importantly, if we look at then the next phase transition that happened just very recently, the rise of hominids and the extra power that we seem to have as a collective human race, what we find is that even this phase transition came around not through hominids learning how to outcompete each other or outcompete the rest of nature, but again, through increase in cooperation. When humans began to find themselves, when our early hominid, pre-human ancestors found themselves separated on the savannah in the Rift Valley in Africa, and millions of years ago, what happened is those early hominids were vulnerable to predators, and those who learned to collaborate were the most successful. And over the millions of years, as we evolved to become Homo sapiens, our identity expanded from self and kin to include the entire group. We evolved to be cooperative, and our human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, is actually what differentiates us from other primates. So we have what social psychologists call moral emotions. We feel in our gut things like compassion, guilt, shame, gratitude, embarrassment. These are all emotions around our role in society. And as a result of that, we don't just act morally because we think we should to overcome those selfish genes, but we do so because it feels right to do so. And traditional cultures around the world understood that, and they built their values according to those understandings. So Ubuntu, for example, in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, is this core overriding principle, which basically translates to something like, I am because you are. And here in North America, just one example, the Lakota tribe has this phrase, Mitakoye Oyasin, which basically means we are all related. And they're referring not just to themselves as a group of people, but to all of life around them. So if we go one level deeper, we can take a look at what are the core principles of these ecosystems that allowed them to be successful, and then try to begin to see how can we apply those principles of ecosystems to principles for human civilization, for an ecological civilization. So to begin with, maybe the most important of all is the one I've already touched on, this concept of mutually beneficial symbiosis. So when you sort of walk out into a forest anytime, you may not be seeing it as it's happening, but all around you are these processes of symbiosis, where plants photosynthesize and provide nourishment for all the animals around them. Insects pollinate the plants. Animals transport their seeds and fertilize the soil. The fungus regenerates the soil from the animal waste. And they even have mycorrhizal networks that transport the nutrients elsewhere in the forest. So this symbiosis is a principle that each party gains from a reciprocal relationship. And if we apply that in general terms to human society, we get to core principles of things like fairness, justice, equity, leading to individual dignity. Then there's the recognition that nature itself is a holarchy, meaning that each part is part of a greater whole, and then has smaller holes within it. And that leads to a core principle of what is sometimes called fractal flourishing, which, because each part is a fractal part of a larger pattern, which is recognition that the health of the whole system requires the flourishing of each part. There's not a zero-sum game, but each part by its flourishing allows the greater layers to flourish too. Another principle is diversity, that a system's health depends on differentiation and integration. If we look at what that means for human society, really it leads to the inherent right of each person and community to participate in cultural, political, and economic power. Then there's a principle of balance. Every part in an ecosystem is in a harmonious relationship with the entire system. We can apply that to a civilization by looking for a steady state economy with equitable distribution of wealth and power. Then the core concept is grassroots self-autonomy. Quite literally, each tuft of grass is making its own decisions about how it can optimize what it's doing there, right there on the earth, with its roots touching the earth. And at the same time, those decisions are part of that greater whole. And if we again look at human society, that leads to an important concept of what's known as subsidiarity, where you push decision-making to the lowest level possible in the system. And there's a principle of embeddedness, recognizing that each component is part of that larger system. And we apply that to our human civilization. It becomes that we recognize that we have an imperative to tend Mother Earth rather than trying to control her. And then the final principle we'll look at just right now is that of regeneration, that ecosystems regenerate themselves, leading to sustainable flourishing into the long-term future. That's perfectly epitomized by the Constitution of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Some of you may know, which has this great statement: in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. So when we translate that into what that means of shifting from our dominant society, it's really a transformation in values. an emphasis on the quality of life rather than material possessions, prioritizing progress in the quality, not the quantity of our lives, basing political, social, and economic choices on a sense of our shared humanity, emphasizing justice and dignity for all, and building civilization's future on the basis of symbiosis with the living earth, where the flourishing of the natural world is a foundational principle. And now I'm going to turn for the last section of this presentation into what these principles might look like if they were actually applied in practice. So an important concept to understand when we talk about an ecological civilization is it's not just talking about something like we need to change the economy or whatever, but it expands to every aspect of our civilization, not just the economy, but distribution of wealth, technology and infrastructure, governance, culture and community, symbiosis with the living earth. And this leads to all kinds of different possibilities, some of which I'll touch on now, but there's obviously a whole lot of more depth that that can be explored. But this is what we'll touch on some of these concepts right now as we go. Now, the first is really to see a drastic reduction in the incredibly extreme global income inequality. And that would lead to particular things such as a global wealth tax that is being discussed actually among the G20 nations right now, leading to potentially ultimately a wealth cap on billionaires and centimillionaires. And that wealth being applied for society in terms of funding universal basic services for people in every different society. We'd be looking at replacing this measure of how successful an economy is doing right now based on GDP, gross domestic product, which really just is a measure of how quickly we are consuming the living earth and turning humans into parts of the economy. But we could replace that by measures of national welfare. One example of these is called the genuine progress indicator, which factors from the GDP, it factors in negatives, reduces it by things like income inequality, pollution, or crime, and increases it by things that are not measured in GDP, like volunteer work, household work, or education. When we look at economics, we've really transformed how we think about it, really along the lines of this brilliant book some of you may know called Donut Economics by economist Kate Raworth, where she restructures the way to think about economics based on what she kind of jokingly calls the donut, which looks like this picture where the outer edge of that donut is the ecological ceiling, which I introduced you to before, essentially some version of those planetary boundaries. And so part of the goal then of an economy is to get back within that ceiling. But just as important is there is an inner boundary of a social foundation of the basic conditions required for people to flourish: water, food, health, education, social equity, housing, energy, gender equality. And so the goal then of an economy is to reduce that shortfall until you get into the donut, into those two barriers and into those two perimeters. So that's a great framework to rethink economics. Then there's a very powerful concept that's often, well, really referred to as the commons. And we can think of the commons as any source of sustenance and well-being that has not yet been appropriated either by the state or by private ownership. And the commons is something that we think of, if we're not too familiar with it, as some sort of old-fashioned term, like the commons that got privatized back in England maybe hundreds of years ago when peasants would graze their sheep on the commons or whatever. But it's really a vast, a much greater set of dimensions where the commons available morally to all of us is nature's contribution, things like the atmosphere, fresh water, sunshine, soil, and the oceans, and also the ancestral contributions from our human ancestors, like language, cultural traditions, technical know-how, scientific knowledge. So we can think of the commons almost like there's a layering of all these different really contributions from the past, beginning with nature's contributions that I mentioned, moving to those core contributions of human society, like language, traditions, and core technologies. More recent contributions from civilizations like writing, law, specialized knowledge. Then more recently, last couple of hundred years, um, discoveries like electricity and then developments like industrialization and global markets. And then very recently, last few decades, things like microprocessors, computer code, the internet, all that is this amazing commons available to all of us. And then someone comes along, right, and does a few tweaks to this incredible wealth that's being created. And he copyrights it and he calls it Facebook and gets investors to invest in him. And then all of a sudden, those few tweaks take all that wealth and transmit it to this one person who right now, Mark Zuckerberg, has a net worth of about $180 billion for just doing those few tweaks to the commons. While, as we looked earlier, about half the world's population earn less than $5.50 a day, which is considered the minimum income people need for basic nutrition and a normal life expectancy. And really, I ask you, is that not one of the greatest moral states of egregiousness in all history? That could be the case. So when we think of the commons, we can actually think of everything else, all that wealth that's been created in the past, as a common wealth, one that is morally eligible for all of us to share. And there's a way that that can be done. And that is called universal basic income, which is a concept that is really beginning to spread around the world, which is the idea of an unconditional monthly payment made to every adult, unconditional, an amount that is sufficient to meet their basic needs. And it's based on this recognition that purposeful work is not, we're told that, people are lazy and selfish, and if they get a little bit of money, they won't do anything good with it, and they'll just use it to become addicts and just watch TV all the time. The exact opposite is true. People is part of our human drive is to actually do purposeful work because people have a fundamental need to feel valued by their community. And there are many programs around the world that have been instituted, experiments of basic income. And what they've seen consistently is when this happens in a community, you see a reduction in crime, child mortality, malnutrition, truancy, teenage pregnancy, alcohol consumption, all these bads, and an increase in goods like health, gender equality, school performance, and even entrepreneurial activity. So another concept that would be potentially fundamental in an ecological civilization would be for these corporations that currently dominate our world to exist for humanity rather than for shareholder return. Some of you may be familiar with these concepts of benefit corporations and certified B Corps, where a company can choose to shift its articles of incorporation, requiring it to consider the impact of its decisions on workers, customers, suppliers, the community, and the environment in general. And these are some names of some companies that have made that choice. There's been a few thousand of them worldwide, but it's had virtually zero impact on the direction our civilization is taking because the large transnational corporations would never even dream of considering changing their articles of incorporation in that way. So in an ecological civilization, we could look at what's called as a triple bottom line of not just profit, but also people and planet as a requirement for corporate charters. So under this scenario, the corporate charters of all transnational corporations would be up for renewal every 5 years, and they would only be renewed at the discretion of community-wide panels chosen by sortition, just like we choose jurors right now, not by regulators appointed by government who are part of the revolving door that then join the corporate executive board 2 years later. But these would be real people chosen in panels, and if they determined that the corporation was not meeting that triple bottom line, they could choose not to renew their charter. So corporations would not just be subject to financial bankruptcy the way they are now, the things that CEOs and the boards always want to avoid at all costs, but subject to the risk of social or environmental bankruptcy, which will lead to a fundamental transformation in transnational corporations around the world. So another aspect we'd be looking at in an ecological civilization is a circular economy, which would increase employment while reducing waste with products designed for repair and recycling, sourcing from recycled materials, and waste being virtually eliminated. We'd see our cities redesigned on ecological principles, so things like community gardens on every block, extensive use of things like energy efficient designs, rooftop gardens, aquaponics, cars banned from city centers, and essential services always within a 20-minute walk, no matter where you lived in the city. Outside of the city, in the countryside, we'd see agroecology replacing global industrial monocrops based on principles of permaculture and regenerative agriculture with greater crop biodiversity, more water and carbon efficiency, the virtual elimination of synthetic fertilizer, and that elimination of factory farming. And people have shown around the world that agroecology can be as productive as industrial agriculture, but without its devastating effects. Then if we look at technology, we'd look at this potential to enable the global commons. Right now, if you look at the left side of this picture, the control of information is centrally managed. And that's why you get these multi-billion, even close to $1 trillion of value getting concentrated in companies like Facebook, Amazon, Uber, Google, or Airbnb, because they control the ledger. And so they have ultimate domination over what happens with their technology. But in an ecological civilization, we'd be moving towards a distributed ledger where the information is actually decentralized to empower and protect collective action, which enables people to then coordinate and cooperate at scale. And this has been shown to work, this kind of distributed ledger, in areas like property law, money systems. And some of you may know the concept of DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations and enterprise structures, information ownership, and even can apply to democracy. If we look more broadly at culture and community, our current domination system has been well described by Ria Nisela in that way as authoritarian and hierarchical social and economic structures, really praising things like abuse and violence, subordinating women and what's defined as femininity to men and what is thought as masculinity, with beliefs and stories that justify and idealize domination and violence. We'd be looking at a shift towards what Ria Nisela calls a partnership system, with more equitable structures that are more democratic, equal valuing of males and females, and high regard for what are stereotypically thought of as feminine values, mutual respect and trust, with low degree of violence, and beliefs and stories that give value to caring relations. If we look more globally at governance, we'd be looking at sort of a commons-based kind of governance, but applied fractally, where we'd see multiple centers of semi-autonomous decision-making, going all the way from neighborhoods to community to city, bioregion, nation, continent, and ultimately the globe, where each level takes each other into account in some competitive and some cooperative set of relationships, with recourse to conflict resolution mechanisms, with what are known as graduated sanctions, if groups don't meet what is recognized as being in the interest of all. Then at the global level, we'd be looking at things like a UN rights of nature that puts the natural world on the same legal standing as humanity, with personhood given to entities like ecosystems, rivers, high-functioning mammals, and ecocide defined as an international crime. We'd be looking at regeneration and symbiosis with the living earth. Some of you may be familiar with the Half Earth Initiative that was put out by the great scientific thinker E.O. Wilson. The idea is to set aside roughly half of the planet for non-human nature, which would be under indigenous stewardship, because they're the people who have been shown empirically to do the best job of working in harmony with their with their ecologies. And at a greater level, ultimately, we'd be looking at building a planetary consciousness with a sort of a hub and spoke network of what is called cosmo-local connections, where on the local side, we'd have place-based identity with a local community focus, face-to-face interactions, like citizen action networks, building trust, agency, and at the same time, be connected to a planetary consciousness. Some of those global social network systems like Facebook, etc., would be converted to the commons and optimized for what is good for all of us. We'd look at greater values of cosmopolitanship, a sense of global citizenship, where we can celebrate diversity while recognizing our deep interdependence. And ultimately, we can see humanity in that scenario becoming more and more like a connected superorganism, a sort of emergent self-organized collective intelligence, where humanity itself could have the potential to begin to see itself and the living earth as an integrated whole. And just to leave you with this concept, as you're probably all aware, the phase we're in right now in the earth has increasingly been called the Anthropocene. This era, which is based on the ideology of human supremacy, when human impact has reached geological proportions, an era that's destructive of life and biodiversity, inherently unsustainable. But the eco-philosopher Glenn Albrecht is the person who coined this term, the symbiocene, as this potential of what we could move towards based on the principle of symbiosis that we've looked at today, with a mutually beneficial flourishing of humans and the living earth, where we'd be using technology, wouldn't be rejecting it, but using it for regenerative, life-affirming practices. And this era could potentially be very long-lived in the Earth's history, where we, as a global civilization, start to learn how to tend Mother Earth. So I'll leave you with that and look forward to a conversation now. And just if you want to explore more of my work, this is my website, it's jeremylent.com. These are the two books written the last few years. Right now, I'm actually in the middle of writing a book on ecological civilization called Ecological Civilization, How We Can Create a Flourishing Future. And if you're interested in joining this conversation globally, we have a deep transformation network, which now has over 4,000 people from around the world who have joined this global community exploring pathways to an ecological civilization. And you can see the web domain at the bottom of the slide there. So I will stop my share right now and open it up to a conversation. Thank you all for listening to that with me.